Alright guys, so our pieces are all now prepped and ready to be glued up. So on all of our outer surfaces, all the stuff you're going to visually see once this thing is together, I made sure to go through and do either a nice hand planed or scraped surface, so they all look really nice. They all have that nice sheen to them that you can only get with a hand plane or a scraper. And so then I went over every piece to make sure they had 2 coats of tried and true original oil on them. So the tried and true original is a mix between polymerized linseed oil and beeswax, so we'll add a nice soft outer coating to this, as well as protecting it with the linseed oil on the inside. So all of our pieces are now fully finished. There won't be any finishing really to do once this thing is glued up, other than minor areas where I might have to touch up, where I might have to cut some glue off, but that will all deal with once we get there. And so this is probably going to be one of the most complex glue ups I've ever done. There's a lot of individual pieces, a lot of little tenons that have to go match up with their mortises, all with glue on them. So we might have a little bit of messy areas that I'm going to make sure I go back in and clean up once we've got this thing in clamps. But yeah, it's going to take a lot of time and patience to make sure that I get this thing together properly. Alright, so glue up is done. Everything came together really nicely. I checked everything. It's all square. We're good to go. Now I just have to leave it for 24 hours in the clamps, and we should be good to move on from there. So I'm not going to lie, glue ups like this are extremely stressful. This glue up in particular was extremely stressful because you're dealing with, once you get these side panels together, trying to line up those decently heavy side panels on all those little wiggly tenons is kind of challenging. And so if you have someone else in your shop where you can get help, probably an easier way to do it by far. And so I'm not going to say this was impossible. It was definitely doable, as you can see here, but it definitely would be easier with another person, or just someone else to help you align all this stuff. So one thing to note is that when you're fitting your joinery, if your joinery is so tight that you have to bash it together, so your tendons are so tight you have to bash on the end of that piece to get it into the mortise, you don't want that. You want your piece to be just slightly, like you should be able to slide it in and pull it out without too much effort. And the reason for this is as soon as you put water-based glue, like Titebond 1, 2, or 3, on that tenon, it's going to start to expand. And so I even had that on some of my joints here, which I already had them loosened up enough that I thought they'd be good. But just because there was so much moisture absorbed into that wood so quickly from the glue, they started to expand and made it quite hard to actually get the pieces on. And so to get the second side onto this thing, I actually had to hammer it on pretty hard and then even pull it together with the clamping force, because it just did not want to go together easily. There's just so much tension building up in those tenons, because by the time you get the whole thing, the whole opposite side lined up on all the tenons, those tenons have had a lot of time to actually soak up that moisture and expand. So it's the way woodwork glue is supposed to work. It's all expected, but you just have to remember to work around it, because doing stuff like this, it's going to be a big problem. Also, when you're doing a glue up like this, you want to make sure you're using Titebond 3. There's not a huge difference between Titebond 2 and Titebond 3. I know Titebond 3 is a little bit stronger, it's a nicer color, all that stuff, but in general, a lot of woodworkers lean to Titebond 2 because it's a little bit cheaper. But in this case, I used Titebond 2 on the sides, and I realized I instantly regretted it as soon as I started doing it, and I should have really changed out my glue bottle to my Titebond 3, but I just kind of kept with it. And so the big difference between Titebond 2 and Titebond 3 is the open working time. So Titebond 2 has a 5-minute open time, whereas Titebond 3 has a 10-minute open time. Now, both of those are just terrifying numbers, and I really wish they were just generally more than that, because I don't know very many woodworkers that want that quick of setup time. And I know you can buy like Titebond Extend and all that. I personally can't, because I can't seem to find it up here in Canada, but it's one of those other options. So Titebond 3 with that extra 5 minutes of open time is just a way better option, especially when you're trying to line up as much of the stuff as I've got on here. The more open time you can possibly have, the better you're going to be. The other thing that I'm waiting to find out if it was a mistake or not is I went through and tried to clean up all the squeeze out with some wet rags. And so when you try to wipe off the glue with wet paper towel, you run the risk of turning it into more of a liquid glue and spreading it over the surface, which is you really don't want to have happen, especially if you haven't pre-finished the piece. If that happens, you're going to end up with this big glue stain. It's going to look horrible. So you really want to be careful there. But I obviously have a few spots on here where that did end up happening. I just didn't wipe it off soon enough. But I think that it turned out pretty well. So the reason I decided to do that on this piece where I normally wouldn't do that is because I've got so many just different little angles and shapes on here. So between like our outside piece and this piece, there's a small bevel in there that I showed you guys already when we were making it. There's a small bevel in there, and so I wouldn't really be able to easily get a chisel in there to slice out any glue that's squeezed out in there. So I wanted to try and wipe it off with water. Now, again, in most of the spots it worked. It's only in areas like between our middle dividers there, our middle drawer supports. Those are where I definitely have a little bit of nastiness I'm going to have to clean up with some sandpaper. But overall, the rest of it looks just fine. So I think this was a successful glue up. We'll have to wait until tomorrow when I actually take it out of the clamps. If it all falls apart, I'm going to be upset, but I really, judging by how hard it was to actually get this thing together, I think we're going to be just fine and going to have a really good result. And again, most importantly, all of this stuff in here was square. And so one of the downsides to doing the glue ups like this is that you don't have the ability to check for square or do anything. And so with a frame like this, where it's all mortise and tenon joinery, you do not want to deal with trying to figure out what's square or not when you're doing the glue up. You want to make sure that when you put that tenon into that mortise, that piece is going to be square to the side, which when we were doing all of our dry fit ups and that, I made sure of that, multiple times. Every single time I would check it and just make sure that the tenons were staying square to the sidewall. And again, the best way to do that is just to put it dryly in, clamp the whole thing together so that's under the same clamping force that you're going to do when you glue it up like this, then check for square, because this is typically where it's going to hold it, because everything is now under tension and that glue is going to hold those pieces under tension for a long time. And so you really shouldn't have to check for square once you've done your glue up. You really want to make sure that before you ever put glue on your piece, that your mortises and your tenons are registering as square against one another before you ever get glue near the piece.